What's the scariest true story you've heard or told? There have been several confirmed cases in a few different countries of people living in other people's houses unbeknownst to them. I believe one case went on for a couple of years. The intruder would wait until the homeowner would go to work and then sneak out and steal small amounts of food as not to be noticed. Well, eventually the homeowner did notice and couldn't figure out where his food was going. So he set up a hidden camera to record it. I can only imagine how scary it would have been to come home from work one night and sit down to watch the video. Skipping through hours of stillness. To suddenly come across a person crawling out of your attic. And then the slow realization that that person is still in your house at that moment. And then the retroactive fear of thinking back to all the times you laid awake at night and heard a noise, which you just dismissed as coming from the pipes or the old wooden beams. But actually it was a fucking person just above you. It gives me the heebie-jeebies every time I think about it. I met a guy who had been traveling Australia with a couple friends. Hitchhiking around as many of us had done. One of his friend told him they were near his distant uncle's house, whom he'd never met before. He got a phone number from a family member, and as they had hoped, the uncle offered them a place to stay. He picked them up in town and drove them out to his rural property way out in the bush. They said he seemed like a pretty normal guy. Friendly and cheery. When it was time to set up a place to sleep, the uncle took them to a closet that was totally full of sleeping bags and bedrolls. They didn't think much of it at the time and all grabbed a kit and set up on the living room floor. They stayed a couple days and nothing out of the ordinary happened. And afterwards the uncle drove them to the bus station and they continued on their way. About a year later that man was arrested and charged with several counts of murder. He was the man who was picking up young hitchhiking backpackers and slaughtering them. The guy who told me this story was 100% certain he had slept in the sleeping bag of one of his victims. One day as a kid I was exploring the forests near our house with my cousin. The forest was on a hill. But there were several craters there because of bombs that were dropped there during the World Wars, Germany. One day we saw a backpack at the bottom of one. We tried to climb down. But it was kinda steep and slippery. So we didn't want to risk falling. We planned on returning later with a rope. And went home. The next day news story was that there was a backpack found with the remains of a girl. In that forest. A guy walking his dog found it. After the dog wouldn't stop barking and going crazy at the edge of the crater. While staring at the backpack. We stopped exploring the forests after. Edit. English is hard sometimes. Lived W3 other girls sophomore year of college. All three took off early for spring break. Leaving me alone in the house. First night alone. I heard someone bang on my front door at 2 a.m. Then I hear more knocks at the back door. A man yells, "Boulder police. Open the door." When I didn't, I heard body slams against both doors. Soon I hear, "Little girl. Open the door. We know you're alone." At this point I'm so scared I keep accidentally dialing 611 instead of 911. When I eventually do get the police. Cars roll up, thankfully, just minutes later. Officers have 4 boys from our school hockey team face down on the grass. I had to file restraining orders against them, and the kicker, one lived across the street from me and we'd never spoken a single word before then. When I worked in healthcare I had a patient who got a sinus infection. He stopped taking his antibiotics after a few days because he felt better. His sinus infection came back with a vengeance. When he got to the emergency department he was presenting with stroke symptoms. The infection had spread to his cranial cavity. There was so much pus that it was twisting his brain. No one thought he would survive the surgery. The family was advised to expect the worst. Amazingly he actually survived. He ended up needing 3 more surgeries to wash out and spent almost 2 months in the hospital. Take your full dose of antibiotics. People. The Reina Marroquin story, a young lady had an affair with her boss in the 1960s. Got pregnant. After threatening to tell her boss's wife. She was killed by her boss, who then put her body in an industrial barrel. He hid the barrel in his house for years and none of the various owners opened it due to the weight. Finally one guy decided to dispose of it in the 90s, and when he opened it he saw it contained something. An investigation traced the barrel and girl back to the man, who then killed himself before police could come arrest him after confirming he was the father of the unborn baby via DNA. The lady's mother was in her late 80s when she was told her missing daughter was finally found. She claims that she had been having dreams about her daughter being inside a metal container for years after she had gone missing. I was in class in 10th grade and the teacher was asking everyone how their weekend was. The quietest girl in the class spoke and while breaking down in tears said she was on a trip in the mountains with her mom. They made a stop for some reason and she looked over the cliff and saw an overturned vehicle with a dead family scattered about. When I was about 8 years old, our school was doing swimming lessons as part of the curriculum. My mom worked late, so we went to after-school care and didn't get home until after dark. When we got home, Mom asked me to take my wet togs, bathing suit, and towel out to the clothesline to dry so I could use them the next day. I was so confident going outside to do this and had this real feeling of being a big kid. I walked into our backyard only for a man to be running at me. I screamed, jumped inside and instinctively locked the back door as I did so. As this was happening, my mom told me she heard the guy jump the gate which was next to her bedroom just after she heard me scream and came running to find me. I slept with the light on until I was 16 and I get my husband to go outside for me while it's dark. One of my friends was drugged by a nice-seeming girl at a bar that tried to sex traffic her. The girl got her an Uber to an address she didn't know under the guise of "get my drunk friend home," but she woke up on the way and told the driver she didn't know where they were going. They called the cops. Apparently that wasn't the first time that week they'd heard the same story and they recognized the address as one they were already tracking. If she hadn't woken up on the way, she might have been trafficked by now. Apparently they use younger, safe-seeming girls to do the collecting a lot of the time. And #X200B. Edit. To those of you who asked. This was in the US. In Washington state a few years ago. We don't know who tried to do it. The bar was informed. To the people telling me this didn't happen or is made up. I'm just relaying what she told me after it happened. I don't have any reason to believe she was lying about it, nor do I have anything to gain, and it'd be pretty fucked up to make up something like this. One of my dad's friend's wife was murdered by some crazy dude walking down the street. This guy had just been released from a mental hospital and literally just stabbed her as she walked home. When my dad's friend came back, he thought she had just taken the dogs out for a walk, so he walked along the normal walk route and he saw loads of blue lights. He was stopped by a police officer and wasn't allowed any closer until he saw that it was his wife. I am not sure I remember all the details correctly, but anyway. A guy was cleaning a giant cooking tank at a tuna factory. It was so big that he had to climb all the way in. Someone else didn't check and protocol was broken along the way somewhere. Second guy locked the barrel and turned it on, cooking the guy inside alive. My mother never taught me to swim because when she was a teenager she saw a friend get sucked into a whirlpool at the bottom of a drainage lake that is the deepest body of water within a few hundred miles of us. They didn't find his body for days. I was a director of my college's student government. There was this dude who was always willing to take on projects, so I gave him lots of stuff. I remember thinking B was very charismatic and well-dressed. And when he told me he owned a startup clothing company, I bought some stuff from his website. It was typical for student government kids to end up at the same parties, and I ran into him several times outside of committee. I was studying abroad my senior year and I was here on Reddit. Saw an article with the guy's face on it. Turns out he raped 12 girls at my university. It was apparently well known, but because his father was a dean wealthy professor, it kept getting swept under the rug. Apparently he was using extracurriculars like the student government to keep coming back to campus after he had been removed from his classes. Edit. Fuck, this blew up. Below is a link. Abby Honold tweets there were actually as many as 17 victims, but she and another girl were the only ones who testified. My Snapchat feed was filled with girls I knew talking about their experiences with him at the time. His father was just wealthy and a professor. Not a dean. My bad fam, it was 5 years ago. And as another note, I was just a student director in the student-run undergrad government. Some people seemed to think I was faculty and responded as such. The Lake Bodom murders are very scary. Like, there are 4 teens who go on a camping trip in Finland. The next morning, 3 of the teens are found murdered. And one of them is almost dead and severely injured. But survived. No one knows who the murderer is today. 44 years later, the 4th teen, Nils, who survived, was accused of murdering them and gets sent to prison. But then he was released a year later. Because there was little DNA evidence to prove this. and no good evidence to prove that he murdered them at all. However, there is circumstantial evidence such as he allegedly fought his one friend due to an argument and was drunk. Some say this could have ended in accidental and/or intentional murder. However, I personally highly doubt that Nils is guilty. I couldn't find much information on who Nils thought the murderer was. So my thoughts are 1. It's too traumatic for him to remember. Or 2. He didn't recognize the person. Some other key suspects include the manager of the camp, who was known for being quite hostile, an ice cream vendor who admitted to the crime on his deathbed, and a man who lived only a short distance from the camp who claimed to be in Germany during that time. However, there is much doubt for his claim. There was a sketch released of the alleged murderer, who seems to be an unsettling picture of an older man. And you can find a photo of the man, who looks like the guy in the sketch, attending a police speech. I added some information that I missed from this case based on the replies to this, and edited some information I seem to have been off on. Much thanks to everyone for adding more info. And also much thanks to anyone who corrected me. I made sure to double check my post now, to make sure all my information is correct. Co-worker's dad was babysitting his baby boy for him. At one point, Granddad went into the nursery to check on the baby and found that he'd somehow reached for the window blind strap and tangled himself up in it to the point where he was choking. Baby was already blue and all of the veins in his face had popped. Grandpa frantically dialed 911. EMS was there in 2 to 3 minutes and they brought the little fellow back to life and he's okay now. Wow, you guys really blew this up overnight for me. For the parents here freaking out. Really. Check to see how close to the crib any hanging cords like this are. When they brought the little guy to the hospital, they separated and questioned the parents and grandpa over and over like they were suspected of doing this on purpose. Of course, it got sorted out as a true accident. The child is now in his 20s and all is well with him. When I was young, I saw a documentary about a guy who got flesh-eating bacteria in his nasal cavity. It ate his face and he's still alive. Eventually they removed the bacteria by removing the eaten parts of his face. He got a prosthetic face, which back in those days was basically a plastic Halloween mask that tried to look human. At the end of the documentary, he took the mask off. His face from his forehead down to his mouth was just a hole. It was a fungus, not bacteria, apparently. I had an associate that was a fireman. He had to go find the head of his brother-in-law after a car accident. Then he had to console his sister when she heard. Tough bloke. Can you imagine that being your day? I'm a crime writer and once interviewed a woman who told me an unrelated horror story about something that happened to her as a girl. When she was like 10, she had trouble sleeping and imagined the boogeyman was living in her closet, staring at her during the night. Every night she would come down and tell her parents, and every night her father would tell her the boogeyman didn't exist and she should go back to bed. Well, this happened for several nights and the father got tired of it. So that night he walked her back to her bedroom, turned on the light, and said, "I'll show you there's no boogeyman," and went to open the closet door. But something on the other side held it shut. He sent his daughter out of the room and forced the door open to find that a man was inside. He'd been sneaking into their house every night to stand in the girl's closet and watch her, and maybe more. He beat the ever-loving shit out of the man and the man went to prison. When I interviewed this woman I looked him up online. He'd recently gotten out on parole and had skipped out on his weekly checks. There was a warrant out for his arrest and nobody knew where he was anymore. People are asking for the source. I googled his name for the first time in years and, well, the good news is he's in prison again. When I was a little girl 9 years old or thereabouts, I was playing at the school down the street from my house. It was the middle of summer and myself and a girlfriend were hanging around watching the boys play street hockey. One of the boys called my name and said a man in the parking lot was looking for me. The parking lot was mostly obscured by the building, but I could see an old 70s style van that hadn't been there earlier. I was walking over to the van when the mother of one of the other kids showed up looking for her son and asked me what I was doing. When I told her someone in the van was looking for me, she took my hand and started to walk with me and the van pulled out and sped away. Friend's mom walked me home and I wasn't allowed out of my yard without my parents for the rest of the summer. I was so upset and didn't understand why I was being punished. It was only years later that I understood that I was likely being targeted by some opportunistic scumbag for who knows what. Thanks Mrs. Gibson. Wherever you are. Edited to add. Thanks for all the awards. Kind internet strangers. Just wanted to address a few FAQs. My parents didn't say they were punishing me. They just kept me close to the house. So I assumed that I was being punished. I lived in a very small, safe we don't lock our doors town. Kids roamed the streets from sun up until sundown. Typically. Playing in the old quarries and on railway tracks and on gigantic limestone hills and all kinds of shit we'd never let our kids do now. A few people were worried about Mrs. Gisbon's son. He was fine. We all were. She had come in from the other entrance to the schoolyard behind us, whereas the boys were closer to the parking lot. I barely got within shouting distance of the van before it sped off. Most kids are unfortunately abducted by people they know. So I have no way of knowing if it was some creep who knew me from all the activities my parents had us in, or just some opportunist guy who said to the boy, "You know that girl over there? Can you call her over for me?" We were all taught about stranger danger. Shout out to Canadians who remember stay alert. Stay safe. And because Mrs. Gibson showed up, I'll never know if those lessons sunk in or not. My baby's crib caught fire in the middle of the night. Some people's literal worst nightmare. Edit. My baby was in it and he was severely burnt and spent a month intubated and in a medically induced coma. He is 5 now and is okay though. The fire was a freak accident. His humidifier caught fire, smoldered for a little while and drained the oxygen in the room before the smoke alarm went off. When we opened the door to his room, it flooded with oxygen, creating a backdraft and launched a fireball at his crib. This was his crib the next day. Edit 2. A lot of people are asking for which humidifier it was and which company, etc. I am unable to elaborate any further than, I can say that a freak accident can occur with any electrical appliance you have, from fridges to table lamps. This specific accident was a humidifier, but the nature of the accident is not exclusive to humidifiers. Check your appliances and maintain them. Discard them if they develop any issues and follow any safety instructions that might have been included with them. Also, make sure your smoke alarms are in working order. It could save a life. My mom was stalked by a guy in her chemistry class. This was back in the late 70s. During her first semester at college. They were lab partners. And mom thought he seemed cute and nice. And was too shy at the time to ask him out. But she said if he'd asked her out, she would have went. They were friendly with each other in class. But their paths didn't cross outside of that since they were in different majors. As the semester wore on, however, she noticed he was often waiting for her outside of her other classes. The library. The student union. Out in front where her dad picked her up and dropped her off. This continued into the spring semester. Puzzled, but not yet alarmed, she asked him how he always seemed to know where she was. He proudly said, "Oh, I asked the registrar's office for a copy of your schedule. My mom went to complain to the secretary who gave out her schedule. And the secretary blew it off because, you guys are dating." Luckily, mom had already arranged to transfer to a different school for sophomore year. And spent the remaining time left avoiding him. She never saw him after that. But it wasn't over. Flash forward to grad school. Mom was at work. And grandma gets a knock on the door. Since the man at the door was in a naval uniform. And my grandmother was a Navy nurse. She let the man in. Because he looked rather sad. He starts off by saying how sorry he is for my mother's loss. Which completely mystified grandma. "Well, ma'am, I just got back from overseas. And I found out my friend recently killed himself. He spoke so highly of his fiancée. Your daughter. And I wanted to meet her." My grandmother told him her daughter didn't even have a boyfriend at the moment. Let alone a fiancé. It doesn't take too long to establish the man's deceased friend in question was in fact mom's stalker. The naval lieutenant was pretty upset. And my grandmother even more so. She made him leave before mom got home. The weird thing about the stalker's death is that it was ruled a suicide. But he hanged himself from a very high up tree branch you'd need a ladder to get to. And his hands were tied behind his back. From what my mother later learned, he had a tendency to snoop and generally stick his nose in places they didn't belong besides the obvious stalking thing. And this didn't win him too many friends. So it's anyone's guess who he might have pissed off. My mom always concludes this story kind of nonchalantly. Like, yeah, back in those days, They didn't really know much about stalking. They've gotten a little better in terms of awareness now. It gives me the creeps to think what could have happened if he escalated his attempts to follow her after she left that school. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to drop a like. If you would like to see more content like this in the future, subscribe and turn on notifications to be notified about future videos. Now check out one of these interesting videos.